I'm going to show you a document that's wild, and you're only going to see it because a library research assistant dug into the Congressional Archives and pulled it out for us. The year was 1949. The United Nations Charter, signed in the wake of World War II, was a mere 4 years old, and in the House of Representatives, the Committee on Foreign Affairs was holding hearings on HCon Res 64. For humans out there, that's House Concurrent Resolution 64. And the reason HCon Res 64 was so significant, and the reason I'm going to show it to you today, is because were it reintroduced in today's political environment, it would definitely end political careers of both the author and the sponsors. The hearing was titled, "To Seek Development of the United Nations into a World Federation." And if that doesn't make it obvious to you what this is about, hear for yourself the words of the resolution. It is the sense of the Congress that it should be a fundamental objective of the foreign policy of the United States to support and strengthen the United Nations and to seek its development into a world federation, open to all nations with defined and limited powers adequate to preserve world peace and prevent aggression through the enactment, interpretation, and enforcement of world law. This was a serious discussion of reforming the United Nations into a type of world government, a sovereign power with enforceable law, the aim of which would be to create a permanent peace. No, this wasn't just some obscure niche issue. The chair noted about 100 congressmen were sponsoring the various resolutions dealing with a world federation, including future Vice President Hubert Humphrey and future President of the United States, a Mr. Kennedy from Massachusetts. Just imagine if something like this were introduced today. The idea of world government is something relegated to online conspiracy sites, and even there as something to desperately avoid. It would be too simple to dismiss House Concurrent Resolution 64 as an after effect of World War II. Politicians so shocked by the tremendous loss from the conflict that their capacity for political calculus simply slipped away. World government had been a strain of thought for a very long time. In De Monarchia, Dante calls for a universal emperor, one to push humankind towards a shared potential. In the 18th century, Immanuel Kant argued for perpetual peace through a federation of republican states. Even Albert Einstein, who in 1929 referred to nationalism as the measles of mankind, called for a world government which could control offensive weaponry after the nuclear strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy actually has a great article on this if you want to read further. Einstein wasn't alone. There were many in the US and Europe who saw the United Nations and the NATO alliance as potential stepping stones towards world peace enforced by, well, force. At the same time, in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, a global governing arrangement wasn't a foreign concept either. Though Joseph Stalin employed a doctrine of communism in one country, the Communist International he funded clearly desired world communist governance or an association of sovereign communist states. The point being that dismissing world government as quixotic is a modern phenomenon. What if we wanted world government? The potential economic consequences of more fluid trade, movement of people, and resource distribution are massive. But how would it be structured? I usually hate caveats, but I feel like I need to make one just to be clear with you. I'm not a proponent of world government, neither is my collaborator for this video, Soliloquy. We made this exploration in order to research an idea with you. So let's go deeper with this topic. Thomas Hobbes argued in the 17th century that you are capable of killing any other human. Sure, he says, the other person might be manifestly stronger in body or of quicker mind than you, but with either tools or the help of others, even the weakest can defeat the strongest. In a time of scarcity, when there isn't enough water, food, shelter, mates to go around, before civilization, if you and I want the same thing, Thomas Hobbes thought we would endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. As he wrote in chapter 13 of his book, Leviathan, there is always war of every one against every one. Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. In this natural condition of mankind, life is solitary, and you and I are in a nasty and endless competition. This short, brutish life is what Hobbes called the state of nature. This is a pessimistic vision of humankind, but also, you might have noticed, a vision of total freedom. Surviving is your natural right, and therefore you may take any action that helps you obtain the things you need. Because this life is miserable, ephemeral, and full of violence, Hobbes presented a solution. We could emerge from the state of nature by coming together, giving up some of our natural rights, and entrusting them to a sovereign through a social contract. Whether one person or many, the sovereign government ends the state of war among the many by force. The social contract is binding. The sovereign has absolute authority. For the sake of our discussion, expand this concept to the international stage. Instead of individuals existing in a constant state of competition for resources, we have nations fighting for dominance of the globe. Though they may enter treaties between one another, history has shown that without a higher power, paper holds no sway when one nation becomes aggressive against another. As Hobbes wrote, "Covenants without swords are but words." Perhaps then, in the same way individuals could come together and give up natural rights to achieve peace through a sovereign, so too could nations, in their state of war, give away some of their sovereignty to one greater and achieve a perpetual peace. In this frame, whether speaking softly or not, without a global leviathan, diplomacy between nations will default to the one with the biggest stick. Now, if you've been listening so far, you might be wondering, the United Nations is already an institution with 93 member states, a peacekeeping force, the ability to sanction, and a universal declaration of human rights. Why doesn't it qualify as world government? Though the 1945 UN Charter has the goal of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war, it is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members. As Mary Ann Glendon puts it in A World Made New, the great powers had gone along with the human rights language, but they made sure that the Charter protected their national sovereignty. She goes on to quote Article 2, Section 7 of the UN Charter. "Nothing contained in the present Charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state." There's nothing within the UN Charter to allow for offensive enforcement to keep the peace. It's no global leviathan. So what would real world government look like? Though the mind naturally drifts to dystopian tyranny forcing chains upon the globe, serious proposals don't go in this direction. An ambitious vision of world government comes from the 1945 book by Reeves, The Anatomy of Peace. Known as the Bible of World Federalism, it called for something much more direct than the UN Charter. Just as peace, freedom, and equality of the citizens of a nation require within their state specific institutions, so peace, freedom, and equality of men on this earth between nation-states require specific institutions, authorities separate from and standing above national authorities. Specifically, Reeves called for a world constitution, either independent or emanating from an amended UN Charter, for an international police force to maintain order, one more powerful than the armed forces of the nations it would rule over. To prevent a nuclear holocaust, a common sovereign order of law would be necessary. Outside of that, any security is but an illusion. Elected delegates of each nation would receive mandate from the people to draft this constitution and debate world law. "There is no first step towards world government," he wrote. "World government is the first step." Another prominent plan can be found in the 1958 textbook World Peace Through World Law, which called for a proportional world assembly based on member state populations, and an exclusive military, meaning all other militaries would be banned. The World Development Authority, in Article 4 of the proposed revised UN Charter, would be given the power to redistribute wealth across the globe, to forcibly solve economic disparities between different regions of the world. Though serious, both these proposals were written without the expectation of implementation. Reeves mentioned the chances of world government were not much. More realistic activists see the need for incremental change. A campaign for a UN Parliamentary Assembly seeks to form a parallel body to the UN General Assembly, which at first would be a consultative body, but over time would grow to be able to adopt universally binding regulations. In his book, The Idea of World Government, James A. Juncker gives us a pretty fleshed out structure for a federal union of democratic nations, based on two unique rights of member nations: the permanent and inalienable right to withdraw peacefully, and two, right to maintain under its direct control whatever military forces and armaments it deems necessary, including nuclear weapons. This means nations could join and depart at their discretion, keeping substantial sovereignty while inside the organization. Additionally, the federal union would include separate branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, while pushing members to uphold ideals of open and free elections in comportment with the name Union of Democratic Nations for their citizens. To illustrate the structure of the proposed system, let me bring in my friend Jonathan. You may know him better as the YouTuber Soliloquy.
Thanks, Will. Any such union will need to establish its own governing bodies, legislative, executive, and judicial, and a system is proposed for each of these. The legislative branch, the Union Chamber of Representatives, would consist of approximately 200 representatives, directly elected by the populations of their respective districts, for 5-year terms. Given the number of members currently sitting in national assemblies, this number seems ambitiously low, and results in about one representative for each of today's nations. It therefore seems natural that the districts will be equivalent to the nations that join, with a sole representative each. This of course is a disaster for minorities within the districts who would be unlikely to be represented, and so I would expect this number to greatly increase. This also raises a question of disproportionate representation, with different districts having different populations. However, here we are presented with an answer. Any measure would need to be approved by two methods. First, with votes from each district weighted based on the district's population, and second, weighted by financial revenue. This simulates a bicameral legislature, with a unicameral one, although, as a New Zealander, I have little problem with a single House of Parliament. However, the primary motivation for this is to ensure that any measures passed are approved by both populous and prosperous regions, thereby preventing a drastic redistribution of current world income, which would be opposed by the wealthy districts, or any measures that poorer nations view as re-establishing colonial-style exploitation. There are less details put forward for the other two branches of government, but for the sake of completeness, the head of the executive branch, the Union Chief Executive, would be elected by popular vote across the Union for a term of 10 years. And the judicial branch, the Union High Court, will be composed of 25 judges, 5 of whom are elected each quinquennial legislative election for a 25-year term.
Juncker's presumption of separated powers and that each nation reserved the right to leave at any time sets his structure apart, but for the other plans, the permanence and eternity really leaves you and me with the terrestrial conundrum. On the one hand, there's a growing proliferation of nuclear weapons across the globe. While less than 10 states have nuclear weapons, according to the Council on Foreign Relations, more than 30 others, including Japan, Germany, and South Korea, have the technological ability to quickly acquire them. With each successive sovereign controlling such weapons, the chance that one might violate international treaties and use them increases. Again, covenants without swords are just words. Each day carries the risk for the breakdown of international order. Emery Reeves called on this in 1945, writing, "How long will the United Nations Charter endure? With luck, a generation? A century? There is no one who does not hope for at least that much luck, for the Charter, for himself, for his work, for his children's children. But is it enough to have peace by luck?" But if we, the community of world nations, can't hope to restrain ourselves from using weapons of mass destruction in perpetuity, the option to avoid that is equally terrifying. Under a global leviathan, one would ensure that no armed conflict could break out, that no nation could use nuclear weapons. But how could we object to a government so powerful? In Hobbes' model discussed earlier, we couldn't. But thinkers like Locke, upon which the American constitutional system is based, reserve the right of citizenry to depose oppressive regimes if they fail to protect our inalienable rights. It is the right of people to be governed by consent, or change their government. Or in the case of world government, the right of humanity to demand a new regime. How could something like this be achieved with a global leviathan enforcing peace? What if it, like many authoritarian systems do, declared non-violent dissent a disruption? Furthermore, how presumptuous would we be to see our time as the end of history, our revolutions as the last to ever be necessary, our blood the last to ever be spilled? We had the American, the French, the Haitian Revolution. We had decolonization, a new international order after 2 world wars, a great leap forward, a wall's collapse. Let's just have one more revolution, one more to bring about a world government, and we can have peace between nations forever. An enticing, arrogant option. Having said that, we are primordial in the nuclear age. Apes with eyes pinned on a lightning-induced eruption of fire. Less than 100 years have passed since the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The vast proliferation of globe-destroying weapons, controlled by imperfect, often delusional and craven human beings, leaves us but a minute from midnight. Will our grandchildren hold us in disdain that we sacrifice their world in order to starve the Leviathan, our bestial savior from Armageddon? This video is a collaboration with Soliloquy. On his YouTube channel, he animates your curiosity, and he does a good job of it. So you deserve each other. Watch some of his best content here or in a linked comment below. Go binge watch, go subscribe to Soliloquy. Later, guys.